You mentioned your dad there briefly. I'm curious, what were conversations like at the dinner table? I mean, your family has been political, but also very, very religious. And I know you studied theology at Oxford. Were you constantly talking about policy? Because obviously you're very well versed in it. And of course, then you spent some time in the city as well in the financial markets. I mean, it's quite an interesting background that you bring to the table. But, what was it like as a kid?
Uh, yeah, I mean, our family is quite political. I mean, I'll talk about my dad just because that's the easiest sort of answer. I mean, he and I have always been political, and I kind of was very interested in politics from a young age. It's been in my lifeblood. His engagement with politics has been something which sort of has grown almost at the same time as I've grown up. And particularly when I was a child, he was interested, but he was never involved. Towards my kind of teenage years, he got more and more and more involved, and I got more and more and more interested. I studied it at school. I was interested. I was a student of history, politics, geography. Kind of interested in the world as it's being cast today. And then, of course, theology, as you rightly mentioned. I mean, theology, in my opinion, faith, to use a much broader term, but faith is like the silent ocean current, which will lead all boats to one shore. I mean, it's such a powerful force in this world, for both positive and negative, and an understanding of faith and what motivates people to do certain actions, and what motivates people to think beyond this world is kind of, I mean, in British political debate, it's very much ignored, which I think is hugely to the detriment of Britain, and hugely also to a misunderstanding of much of our modern world. American politics engages with faith far more actively than British politics does. So Dad and I kind of growing up, well, when I was growing up, were always back and forth about policy ideas and about political discussion and faith-based discussion, and what was going on in this country or any other country. And part of that then also became his interest, which has always been on the kind of social justice side of things. He's always been very concerned about social justice. You can see that in any of his speeches in the House of Lords. His maiden speech talked strongly about his own upbringing, which was very tough, which is one of the reasons that the Labour bench find it difficult to attack him, because he comes from a background which they traditionally have tried to weaponize as their own. And his policy area has always been social justice. His work on prison reform has been motivated by his obsession with family, and family policy has been at the forefront of his entire political work. For me, my political interest has, I'm not saying that I'm not interested in the same areas we are, but for me, I've always been more of a kind of geopolitical, interested in how the world works, how it's put together kind of guy. And, that has then been, that has then reflected itself in, for example, my interest in the European Union. I mean, I was always fascinated by this kind of empire across the sea, debate we had in the UK. And from a very young age, that's actually a funny conversation, which not many people know, but, Dad was actually quite in favor of the European Union when I was growing up as a child. And, when I was a teenager, I remember having fierce arguments with him about it. We would often go back and forth about this. And I just said, this whole concept is a nonsense. And it was very much a kind of Paul Damascene, road to Damascus moment, when the scales kind of fell from his eyes, and he realized that David Cameron had come back with nothing from Brussels, and at that moment sort of said, "Wait, what is this? They're never going to help us out. They're never going to want to renegotiate. They're never going to give us anything that we want." So at that moment, he had this kind of, as I say, Paul on the road to Damascus moment, and he was then a Brexiteer, and that was kind of great for me. And then he became, as often converts to the cause do become, he becomes the most zealous of fighters. And so, he was then very, very pro-Brexit and hugely on side. And obviously then financially, we supported the Vote Leave campaign. He and I have always had sort of a yin and yang kind of relationship in terms of politics, where he's been far more concerned with kind of social, educational policy, And I've always been sort of the more like economic, regulatory environment, international fiscal community and geopolitical debate, because that's kind of what I find interesting. And of course, that doesn't always attract many votes in the domestic market because most people don't really care about foreign policy that much. But for me, that's just been my ballpark. And he and I have consequently kind of fielded off each other quite well. If there's something which has come up which is more in his ballpark, I've been able to hand it off very aptly to him. And if there's something which is more kind of apt for me, he's handed it off to me. And that played out really well in the Brexit area. I mean, he obviously handed a lot of that discussion to me, but also did speak, on it. We both kind of twinned together, but Brexit was particularly sort of more my world than his. And so that was kind of fun for me to be involved in British politics at that particular moment in time.